So he wants to give, in the way he tells the whole story, people a kind of confidence in the story that they have about Jesus and about Christian faith that would survive a challenge. You know, if you understood the story in that way and sort of going through it, it would survive some challenge that somebody might throw up at you. And the interesting case is that this ideal reader, Theophilus, is somebody who has received instruction already. So one of the things that it says, and obviously the fact that you're here, you already recognize this, we don't have to persuade you of it, but that people can be catechized. They can know stuff about their Catholicism, about Jesus, about the Christian story, but they don't know it in a way that can really survive challenges. They don't know it in a way that they can give an account of it. They can be pretty much shoved off by somebody else's objection or something that happens. And, you know, the sort of book reviews are full of these books of, well, I had faith once when I was a kid, and then I grew up and discovered it was a bunch of hogwash. Well, they didn't grow up. That's the problem. So Luke has an important thing, and he wants to tell the story, to present it in a way that would take things that people have heard that have come to these other sources of tradition, the oral tradition and the previous written tradition, but present it to them in a way that it could then stand up to challenge. Another thing that we observe about Luke and reading through the gospel as a whole is that he's also writing it for a different cultural and socioeconomic kind of audience. That this is an audience that is not Jewish, that is non-Jewish, is relatively educated and relatively affluent. And it exists now not in rural Galilee or Palestine. In fact, Luke often makes mistakes about some of those things, but lives in the urban centers where the Pauline mission had spread and established churches in these urban centers in the Roman world. So what kind of presentation does he have to make for them? Well, one of the things that he does, and we'll see this running through a number of the parables, is he sort of has to take what we sometimes in theology today refer to as the option for the poor. That in Jesus' ministry in rural Galilee, the people really were poor for various social economic reasons. And the way in which Jesus is trying to configure action on their part addresses those questions. But in Luke's church, it's a little bit different. And we get the real ideal picture at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles when he describes them sharing everything. So he has to sort of take the option for the poor and try to configure that as a Christian concern. And that it means trying to teach people their concern, how they're going to have solidarity and hospitality with people that they don't ordinarily associate with. So with poorer people. And you will discover we're not doing a meal show, but we could do a meal show based on Luke because there are many banquets and meals and so forth. And I'm not sure you always want to invite Jesus to dinner. Because if you remember some Sundays ago, there were poor Simon the Pharisee, before they got done, he was rather embarrassed between the sinful woman who came in and then Jesus sort of calling him out and basically said, well, you're not so hospitable as you think. You know, you didn't do this and you didn't do that, you didn't do the other thing. So he uses something that's culturally part of their world in order to reconfigure it and try to teach them something that was ingrained in the teaching of Jesus and get them on board with that. Another thing that he has to deal with is the question of whether this Christian movement in the cities is really something that is acceptable. Because in the Greco-Roman world, there was tremendous suspicion of new religious groups, new religious cults, movements. They were thought to be destructive of society. Where did they come from? And particularly, everybody sort of knew Jews had their own thing, and they had their temple in Jerusalem, and they didn't do certain things other people did. And you could sort of deal with that. But now you've got this big movement of non-Jews who are claiming that they worship a God who belongs to the Jews, who aren't participating in the regular civic rituals. They're not turning up. They're not part of that. And that causes a lot of suspicion. So how can Luke explain for people who are going to live under the Roman rule in cities that are part of the Roman Empire the way in which this is actually beneficial? And one of the things that he does is he highlights a number of moral and ethical values that enlightened people, philosophically educated people, would have bought into. And so he could sort of say, well, look, you may think that this is just a bunch of riffraff. It's not a bunch of riffraff. We're not teaching people to be insubordinate. But in fact, these values which philosophers and the more enlightened folk hold are things that are also part of the Christian movement. So he has a number of apologetic questions and issues. And one of the things for us today, I think, is to think about, well, okay, what do we say to culture? That's the second question, the apologetic question. Many of us, I'm sure, the pastors here, every time you pick up the Boston Globe, you wonder what problem you're going to hit as soon as you get to Mass, because they usually have a headline for us that we don't want to deal with. It's like, well, can I get through Mass and hit it in the parking lot? Or can I, what's going to happen next? So we have a cultural problem. We have a cultural image problem that maybe we don't know how to address. We take it on the chin, many of us feel, more than we ought. So that's the apologetic part. The solidarity part, face it, we have a lot of issues about the solidarity with the option for the poor, with the people that are different for us. What is our responsibility for these people? What kinds of things is our responsibility as a Christian community? And, of course, the earlier questions that Luke raised about how do we get our own kind of faith and way of telling the story in order that we can stand up to challenges and don't just sort of say, oh, well, that's the way you see it, and walk away from those challenges. That's what Luke says he's doing. Now, we're not going to take in the whole gospel, but that's a kind of framework. And the parables, and Luke has most of the real famous ones, are examples of one of the methods that Luke understands as oral cultures would also understand, being a master storyteller. Now, our pastor, Father Jim, last Sunday said in passing in his homily that when he gets together with his friends that he's known since childhood and they retell stories, the stories have gotten better and better over the years. So they're really polished up compared to perhaps the original incident of whatever they did when they were teenagers or what have you. And Luke would agree that that's part of storytelling. Again, a storytelling is not just the videotape. It picks up on the meaning of what those things mean to